43 residents stood outside a locked pool gate on the hottest Saturday of the summer, punching in the same four-digit code that had worked every single day for the past 6 years, watching it fail over and over, while a laminated sign zip-tied to the fence informed us that access protocols had been updated and that residents should check their email for further instructions. An email that, as it turned out, had never actually been sent to anyone. My name is Bartholomew Ake Whitlock. I live in Cattail Ridge, a community of about 190 homes, considerably smaller than some of the developments I've heard about in similar HOA disputes, which meant our modest community pool functioned as something close to the single most important shared amenity most families had access to, particularly during the kind of brutal late summer heat wave that had settled over our region that particular week. I want to introduce you to the woman responsible for what happened, a board president named Priscilla Kowalski-Ashby, who had held the position for about 18 months by that point, and whose tenure had, by most accounts I heard from longtime neighbors, been defined by a specific and increasingly frustrating pattern of unilateral decision-making. Changes to community policy and infrastructure made without the kind of advance notice or membership input that most residents, myself included, had simply assumed was standard practice for anything affecting a shared amenity everyone paid dues to access. The lock code change, it turned out, had happened 3 days before that Saturday quietly, without any community-wide notification through the official channels most residents actually checked, an email newsletter, a text alert system, or even a simple sign posted at the pool itself in advance. Priscilla's explanation, once residents began reaching her directly through increasingly frustrated phone calls that afternoon, was that the code change had been prompted by security concerns, following what she described as unauthorized after-hours pool use by non-residents, a concern that, while not inherently unreasonable on its face, did nothing to explain why an entire community had been locked out with zero advance warning during the single hottest weekend of the summer. I want to walk you through the specific frustration of that Saturday afternoon, because it wasn't simply an inconvenience. Several elderly residents, including a couple in their 80s who relied on the pool for low-impact exercise their doctor had specifically recommended, had walked or been driven over specifically for their regular Saturday swim, only to stand outside a locked gate in 98-degree heat with no idea when or how access might be restored. Families with young kids, myself included, my own daughter Zora having been looking forward to this particular Saturday for a week, found themselves turning around and driving home, disappointed, with absolutely no clear timeline for when the situation might resolve. I called the HOA management office directly that afternoon, and the representative I spoke with, sounding genuinely apologetic but unable to offer much beyond procedural deflection, confirmed that the code had indeed been changed at Priscilla's specific request, that the new code had only been communicated via a single email sent to what she described as the board distribution list, a list that, as I would soon confirm, included only the 5 board members themselves, rather than the broader community membership at all. I want to sit with that detail for a moment, because it reveals something important about how this situation actually happened. Priscilla had not simply forgotten to notify residents. She had sent the new code to an internal board-only distribution list, and whether through genuine carelessness or something less charitable, never actually communicated it to the broader membership who needed it, leaving an entire community locked out of an amenity they paid to access during a heat wave, with no functional way to actually get back in. I called Priscilla directly, and I want to tell you, her response to my direct question about why residents hadn't been notified struck me as genuinely bewildering in its lack of urgency. She acknowledged the oversight but stated that she was in the middle of a family commitment that weekend and would look into distributing the new code properly on Monday. An answer that offered no immediate solution to the 40-plus families currently standing outside a locked gate in extreme heat, and that suggested, troublingly, that she saw this as a minor scheduling inconvenience rather than the genuine access failure it actually represented. I want to walk you through the decision that followed, because it turned into something considerably more unusual than a typical HOA dispute resolution, and it started almost by accident, through a conversation with my brother-in-law, Desmond Nkemelu Ferreira, who happened to own a modest but growing pool equipment and access control company that served several communities across our county, a business I knew about only vaguely before that Saturday. Having never had reason to think much about who actually manufactured or serviced the electronic keypad systems most community pools relied on, I called Desmond that evening, mostly venting about the absurdity of the entire situation, and mentioned, almost as an aside, that our pool's lock system was one of the more common commercial keypad models, a detail I only knew because I'd noticed the manufacturer's logo on the unit itself over the years. Desmond, once I described the specific model, told me something that changed the entire trajectory of what I did next. "Bartholomew," he said, "I actually know that keypad system well. My company services and installs that exact model for 3 other communities in the area. If your HOA's management company outsourced the installation and programming to a third party rather than handling it entirely in-house, which is extremely common for smaller developments like yours, there's a decent chance I can find out who actually holds the master programming access for your specific unit. And depending on how that contract is structured, there might be a path here that doesn't require waiting around for Priscilla to get around to it on her own schedule." I want to tell you about what Desmond discovered over the following 2 days, because it turned out to matter enormously, and because it led to a solution that I still find, honestly, somewhat delightful in its specificity. The company that had originally installed and programmed our pool's keypad system nearly 6 years earlier, a small regional access control contractor, had, as it turned out, been quietly winding down its operations over the preceding year, with its owner, an older man named Farouk Delacroix Boyd, looking to retire and sell off the business entirely, master service contracts, client relationships, and all, to any interested buyer. That's where part 2 picks up, because what Desmond and I decided to do next, once we understood exactly what kind of opportunity Farouk's retirement had unexpectedly created, is the reason this story ends with me holding legitimate, complete administrative control over the exact system Priscilla had used to lock out an entire community. And the reason Priscilla Kowalski-Ashby never got to make a unilateral pool access decision again, without every single resident finding out about it immediately. I want to be honest about how genuinely unusual the decision Desmond and I made actually was, because even as we were making it, both of us kept pausing to ask each other whether this was really the most sensible path forward compared to simply filing a formal complaint or waiting for Priscilla to eventually distribute the code properly. But the more we talked it through, the more it made a certain kind of practical sense that went well beyond simply solving our immediate lockout problem. Desmond's own pool equipment and access control business had been steadily growing for several years, and he'd mentioned, more than once over the preceding months, that he was looking for opportunities to expand his service territory and client base within our county. Farouk's retiring company, small as it was, held active service contracts with 3 other communities beyond our own, meaning acquiring it wasn't simply a way to solve one lockout dispute, but a legitimate, sensible business expansion opportunity that happened to also, quite conveniently, put Desmond in direct, contractual control of exactly the system currently locking my own community out of its pool. Desmond reached out to Farouk directly, and I want to tell you, the conversation, once it moved past the initial pleasantries, turned out to be considerably easier than either of us expected. Farouk, genuinely ready to retire and simply looking for a buyer who would treat his existing clients well, was receptive almost immediately, and within about a week, Desmond had negotiated and finalized the acquisition of the company entirely: service contracts, equipment inventory, administrative access credentials, and all. I want to walk you through what this actually meant practically, because it's the part of this story that still makes me smile thinking about it. Once Desmond formally took over the company and its existing service contracts, he held, entirely legitimately, through the exact same administrative channel Priscilla herself had used to change the code in the first place: full programming access to our pool's keypad system. The same system Priscilla had unilaterally modified 3 days earlier without telling anyone. I want to tell you about the message I sent Priscilla once Desmond's acquisition was fully finalized, informing her that our community's pool access system was now serviced under a new ownership structure, and that, per the terms of the existing service agreement the HOA management company had originally signed with Farrock's business, any future access code changes would require proper documentation and would be logged with mandatory notification protocols built directly into the new company's standard service procedures, protocols that Desmond had specifically implemented, at my enthusiastic suggestion, requiring any code change request to include a documented broadcast to the full resident distribution list as a condition of the change actually being processed at all. I want to walk you through the community meeting that followed, because word of what had happened, an entire keypad service company essentially changing hands specifically in response to Priscilla's lockout, spread through the neighborhood faster than almost anything else that had happened during her entire tenure, generating a mixture of genuine amusement and, more importantly, real momentum behind broader frustrations that had apparently been building against her unilateral decision-making style for months before this specific incident. At that meeting, held about 2 weeks after the lockout, several residents spoke about their own prior experiences with Priscilla's pattern of making decisions affecting shared amenities without adequate notice or membership input, the lockout simply being the most disruptive and visible example in a longer pattern several people had quietly tolerated individually without realizing how widely shared the frustration actually was. Priscilla, given the opportunity to respond to the specific lockout incident, offered what amounted to a fairly thin explanation about prioritizing security concerns over communication timing, an explanation that did little to address the more fundamental question a resident near the front raised directly: why an entire community amenity had been effectively closed for an entire weekend with zero advance notice, based on a decision she'd made unilaterally without any board discussion or membership input at all. The vote that followed authorized a formal policy change, requiring any modification to shared amenity access systems, locks, codes, hours, or any other operational detail affecting resident access, to go through a mandatory board vote with documented advance community notification before implementation, a policy that effectively removed exactly the kind of unilateral discretionary authority Priscilla had been exercising throughout her tenure, and that several residents specifically credited the pool lockout incident and Desmond's rather memorable response to it with finally crystallizing enough shared frustration to actually act on. Priscilla did not run for re-election when her term concluded about 4 months later, and I want to tell you, I don't think this was entirely coincidental timing, given how thoroughly the pool lockout story had become something of a local legend within the community by that point, repeated with a certain amount of good-humored disbelief at community gatherings for months afterward. I want to tell you about Desmond's business, because it's actually the part of this entire story I think about most fondly now, well after the actual dispute resolved. What started as a somewhat impulsive solution to a genuinely frustrating Saturday afternoon turned into a legitimate, thriving expansion of his company, now servicing 4 communities across the county rather than 3, including ours, with a reputation largely built on word of mouth from the pool lockout story itself, for exceptionally transparent and communicative service practices, a reputation that, I understand, has helped him win at least 2 additional community contracts in the time since. HOA board specifically citing the mandatory notification protocols he'd built into his standard service agreements as exactly the kind of accountability they wanted after hearing what had happened in our own community. I want to tell you about the pool itself, because it's still there, obviously, still using the same keypad system, though now under service terms that make it functionally impossible for any future board president to lock out an entire community without proper notice ever again. Zora got her delayed Saturday swim about a week after the original lockout, once Desmond's acquisition was finalized and the code was properly restored and communicated to everyone. And I remember standing at the edge of that pool watching her finally get to enjoy the swim she'd been looking forward to, thinking about how strange and specific the path to that moment had actually been. An entire pool equipment company changing hands over what had started as nothing more than a locked gate and an undelivered email. If there's a lesson in this story, I think it's something Desmond said to me during one of our conversations while we were still deciding whether acquiring Farrock's business actually made sense as a response to all this. He said that unilateral authority over shared community infrastructure often persists simply because most residents don't think to ask who actually holds the technical, contractual keys to that infrastructure, assuming that whoever currently exercises administrative control over something like a pool's access system will always continue to do so indefinitely. The moment someone actually traces that control back to its underlying legal and contractual source, sometimes, it turns out, that control is considerably more transferable and considerably less permanently tied to any one person's unilateral discretion than anyone assumed. We traced it, and it turns out that one brother-in-law who happened to run exactly the right kind of business, one retiring contractor looking for a buyer at exactly the right moment, and one entire community's worth of frustration finally given a specific, memorable enough incident to rally around, were more than enough to make sure Priscilla Kowalski-Ashby never again got to lock an entire neighborhood out of its own pool without so much as a proper heads-up. Thumbnail text. SHE locked US out, so I bought the locks.